many of you out there will recall we're supposed to be in Israel right now. At least I am. And the trip was canceled because of expected attack from Hezbollah from Iran. We don't know exactly when that is going to occur, but we were scheduled to meet with the parents of Hersh Goldberg-Polin, John and Rachel in Israel. Hersh, 23 years old, one of the hostages taken on October 7th from the Nova Music Festival. Even though our trip was canceled for those security reasons, we still wanted to make sure we told Hersh's story and remind everybody that more than 100 hostages are still being held by Hamas, including several Americans in that number. We're joined now by Rachel, Hersh's mom from Jerusalem. And Rachel, we appreciate you joining us and sharing your story. How did it happen that Hersh was taken captive by Hamas, and how did you come to find out about it? Take me back to that day on October 7th, if you would, and share with our audience what you experienced.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to tell you about my only son, Hersh, who had just turned 23 on October 3rd. And so for his birthday, he and his best friend, whose name was Honor, they both went to this Nova Music Festival that was happening in the south of Israel on October 6th. And early in the morning on October 7th, very early, the festival came under attack by Hamas and other militant terrorists, and they ended up killing, just at the festival itself, 367 people. Now, Hersh and Honor managed to escape to a roadside bomb shelter that they ran to. First, they tried to escape in a car with some other kids from the festival, and they ended up coming under great rocket fire. So they were hiding in a roadside bomb shelter. Hamas gunmen came to the doorway and were throwing in hand grenades, which Honor was standing in the doorway, picking them up and throwing them out, picking them up and throwing them out. And there were 29 young people who were smashed into this tiny 5-foot by 8-foot bomb shelter. So you can imagine the, density of human beings who were in that tiny space. Honor managed to repel 7 of those hand grenades. The 8th one, while it was in his hand, it exploded and killed him. Then Hamas threw in 3 more hand grenades, which caused a lot of carnage right away. And then they just stood in the doorway with all these kids smashed inside. These gunmen just were machine gun firing into this tiny little space. So most of those young people were dead right away. What we heard from some of the quote unquote lucky ones who were trapped under the dead bodies, and I call them lucky because they were covered in so much blood and gore that they could pretend to be dead. And it is from those eyewitnesses that we heard what happened next, which is that gunmen came in. There were 4, I call them boys because I'm old, but Hersh is 23. I mean, that's not, a boy, that's a young man. There were four young men who were wounded, slumped against the opposite wall. And they were clearly alive. They couldn't pretend to be dead. They were ordered to stand up. They were marched outside. They were put on a Hamas pickup truck. They headed into the direction of Gaza. Hersh's last phone cell signal was at 10:25 in the morning from inside of Gaza. Now at 8:11 in the morning, I observe the Jewish Sabbath in a very religious way. So I don't use technology. I didn't have my phone on. I didn't have a computer, TV, radio, nothing. But we in Jerusalem were hearing bomb sirens going off. And so we got into our safe room. And after 10 minutes, it was just my daughters and I who were home. My husband was already at synagogue. We were going to join him in a little bit. When I got out of the safe room at 8:11, I said to the girls, I'm going to turn on my phone, even though I don't normally use my phone on the Jewish Sabbath, because I need to make sure that Hersh and Honor are okay. And when I turned on my phone was when I saw that there were 2. I'd like to correct myself. I turned on my phone at around, I think it was 8:23. I had received at 8:11 two text messages from Hersh. The first one said, "I love you." And the second one said, "I'm sorry." And that's how I came to know something terrible was unfolding. And what was horrible was I knew that Hersh knew something terrible was unfolding. And of course, what we came to find out is that he, as this whole attack was happening, one of the things that happened is Hersh's dominant arm, he and I are both left-handed, his left arm from the elbow down had been blown off. And he was texting us, I think because he thought he was dying. He had just seen Honor get killed. He had just watched 18 people get killed in front of him in this tiny room of, as I mentioned, 8 feet by 5 feet. And since then, we've really lived on another planet. As you know, if either of you are parents, or you can imagine your own mother and father, what they would be going through if something like this, you can even try to imagine, what they would be going through. And for the last 305 days, we have had one moment of proof of life when 6 months in, Hamas released a propaganda video of Hersh clearly alive. He's reading a script in Hebrew, which we don't speak Hebrew at home, so it was unusual for me to hear him doing that. But he looks gaunt, he looks very pale, he has bruising on his forehead, and he is missing his left forearm, but it is healed. And that's it. That's all we've had. So imagine any of your loved ones for 305 days being held in an active war zone by people who, did this to these young people and to so many people who were caught up in the atrocity of October 7th. There are still 115 hostages being held. They represent 24 different nations. Hersh, as you mentioned, Hersh is an American and an Israeli. He's a civilian. There are 8 US citizens who are still being held in Gaza right now as I'm speaking to you. And there are Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists in that group of 115 people who are still being held. And you very rarely hear that. You kind of hear the media representing them as if they are a monolithic, homogenous clump of people, which is an injustice because they're a very diverse group of people.
Speaking to Hersh Goldberg-Polin, she's the mother of Hersh, who was a hostage taken from the Nova Music Festival on October 7th during the Hamas mass terror attack. Rachel, what kind of updates do you get? You mentioned that your son Hersh is a dual Israeli and U.S. citizen. What kind of updates can you tell us about in terms of where the negotiations stand?
Oh, I wish I knew. I think that because of the nature of this crazy situation, and there are so many hostages, and I think what I didn't mention is it's also a very diverse group of ages. Yesterday was Ariel's birthday. Ariel is one of the youngest hostages. He turned 5 yesterday. There is a 5-year-old being held hostage for 305 days. His brother, Kfir, is 1.5. He's actually lived in captivity longer than he lived in freedom. And the oldest hostage being held is 86. Now, because of so many people, I think the nature of any negotiations or conversations that are happening, both, in normal channels and quieter channels, they're not discussing the details of that with the families. I think it's so sensitive that they know that it is something that they can't talk about with us, which is tremendously painful. I mean, we are living in an ambiguous trauma, a slow motion misery of trauma that is just, it is so exquisitely painful that it's impossible for me to find words to describe it to you.
Rachel, we appreciate you sharing your family's struggle here with all of us, because I think one of the great failures of all of this, as you mentioned, there's still 115 hostages from 24 countries. Obviously, we have a monster audience here in the United States. There are 8 United States citizens. How would
Yes.
how would you assess Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and also other Republicans as well, Democrats, in terms of, if I go back in time, based on what I remember when there were hostages taken in Iran and Jimmy Carter was in office, it was a massive story about, we got to get the Americans home. We got to get the Americans home. I understand there are 107 other hostages that don't have American citizenship, but I'm stunned that the 8 United States citizens that have been there for over 300 days isn't a bigger story in the United States and in our political discourse. Is that frustrating to you? How would you analyze the American side of this to allow 8 U.S. citizens to still be held hostage for this long?
Well, I think it's a real failure on the part, frankly, of the media deciding not to cover this the way that I remember as a child. You mentioned it. I remember being 8 years old and wandering into the living room one night because I couldn't sleep and my father was watching TV. And I said, "What's that number on the screen? And who's that man with that huge head of hair?" And it was Ted Koppel on Nightline, ABC, every single night. He would have in the corner the number of days that it was that hostages, U.S. hostages, were being held in Iran. And it was the top story. And there was tie a yellow ribbon around trees, around lampposts, around telephone poles. And it was a passionate topic for all Americans, all freedom-loving Americans. And that has not been the case with this. And it is a tremendous slap and failure. Now, when you ask about specifically about the president, the administration, Congress, I do have to give kudos that they have been very supportive across the aisle. This has been a real bipartisan issue. I have to say that Senator Lindsey Graham has been very supportive. He came to Israel 3 times. He always brings a congressional delegation that is spanning the aisles, and he stood up in October. He came here and he stood up with Senator Blumenthal, who is a Democrat, and he said, "We are here because this is a human issue. And this is an American issue. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue." And that will remain the case. And every time we go to Washington, which is about every 3 weeks or so, we see people from both sides of the aisle, which is very heartening for us. And look, I think that this is a very tricky situation. We've never in the history of war ever had a situation where people drag 251 hostages ranging in age originally from 9 months to 87 years old, originally from over 40 countries, and have them hiding in a labyrinth of hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath a city with the people who dragged them using them as human shields. So it's a very tricky, without me being a military tactician, it is a very challenging situation. And that's why diplomacy is critical right now. Having a deal is critical because we are not going to be able to save these people by military going in without losing tons of life and probably losing the hostages along the way, as well as kind, brave soldiers who are trying to save them.
Rachel, the prayers of this audience are with you and with your son, and we hope he is returned to you soon, and we hope the rest of the hostages are returned to their families as well. I know it's a very difficult, gut-wrenching story. Thank you for sharing with this audience. People need to know.
Amen. Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate your kindness.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And many refer to October 7th as Israel's 9/11. You just heard from Rachel Goldberg-Polin. That is the mother of Hersh, one of the hostages that is being held still by Hamas. One of our sponsors, Tunnel to Towers, a foundation set up by a brother of one of the 343 firefighters lost on 9/11. We're still losing firefighters to this day, including Daniel Foley. Daniel assisted in rescue and recovery efforts at Ground Zero, but he couldn't have known his heroism would cost him his life more than 18 years later. His death, like so many others, resulted from 9/11 related illnesses caused by the toxic dust that formed when the Twin Towers collapsed. He's just one of many first responders still suffering and dying from 9/11. It's been 23 years, and we have a generation of children unaware of America's darkest day. The Tunnel to Towers 9/11 Institute's helping educators teach children about 9/11. Tunnel to Towers 9/11 curriculum units have scripted lessons, background for teachers, activities for students, and they're based on first-person accounts and designed to meet many academic standards. Help our nation keep its promise to never forget. Donate $11 a month to Tunnel to Towers at t2t.org. That's T, the number 2, T.org.